This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
You are looking at one of the great men of Ireland, a 6th century man who has left his imprint upon the country. You saw the picture of Kevin, one of the great monastic leaders of an ancient Ireland. I should like you to look at this map for a moment. Before we tell the story of St. Kevin, of his greatness, and of what that meant to Ireland, I should like you to have an idea from this map of the monastic influence of Ireland. In the 6th century, Ireland swarmed with monasteries. The monks colonized, evangelized Scotland and all of northern England, Northumberland, of course, having famous monasteries right across this section of the country, and down with lesser results into other parts of England, crossed to the continent, and every place that you see a symbol on this map, in France, in the valleys of the Rhone and the Rhine, up into what is now Belgium, over into what is now Austria and southern Germany, Switzerland, down into Italy, down almost into the heel, then up again, back through this area, over in what is now Poland, and indeed even into Russia. This was the Irish monastic influence for 6 centuries. Rather incredible, isn't it? That this little island should have given so much to the world in the way of monastic settlements. Many of these became so famous that schools developed from them that lasted well into the Middle Ages. This little effort earned for Ireland the title Insula Sanctorum et Doctorum, the island of saints and scholars. Well, it may seem as though it's a little bit into the past, and too much so to be talking about. But the lives of these people, and that particular time in Ireland, is so interesting, so entertaining, that I think it's worth a few more moments of generalization, and then we'll take up the story of one of these famous men, Kevin. You've heard the name so many times today, but it's only recently that it's come again into some sort of popularity. Many of these monks, these early monks, sought the seclusion of the wilderness, even as the hermits of Egypt had, for instance. They sought the seclusion of the wilderness. They sought the seclusion of the islands off the shore of Ireland. They went to mountain tops. They went wherever they could to find the necessary conditions of something like Thoreau, only they may have gone a bit farther away from settled communities. Sometimes they lived in little huts made of stone. We call these beehives today. And here is such a one on the edge of the ocean off the coast of Kerry. Small stone huts, hardly the size of a modern bathroom, or at any rate, since bathroom sizes may vary, we'll say roughly the size of a modern bathroom. And here they lived either singly or in twos, and occasionally in one of the larger stone huts, clachans, beehives, whatever you want to call them, occasionally as many as 7. These were not always built of stone. The one that you saw was. Sometimes they were more simply made of clay and wattles. They built churches, and their churches were small. We're not going to talk about that aspect of their architecture, but it's interesting for me to tell you that these were built in a fashion like this, which we call corbelling, where one stone overlaid the one beneath it until eventually they joined at the top. And some of these are still to be found in Ireland, over 1,000 years old and still watertight without mortar. Well, they lived a rather rigorous life. 1 or sometimes 2 meals a day. Rather hard for us to think of that today. 1 to 2 meals a day, consisting chiefly of bread and vegetables, and a little bit later. When I say later now, I mean 10th, 11th century. And when I say at the beginning, I'm talking about the 6th and the 7th century. But a little bit later, they used cheese and milk, and occasionally a flesh food. Their rule was so rigorous that on the continent, gradually, the monasteries which they established turned to the Benedictine rule, which we regard as a rather severe one. They turned to the Benedictine rule because it was a bit milder. They observed 2 fast days during the week, Wednesdays and Fridays, and they observed 3 Lenten periods. Not only our regular Lenten period, which seems difficult enough for us, but a pre-Christmas Lenten period, the season of Advent, 40 days before Christmas, and then one after Whit Sunday, 40 days after Whit Sunday. So they led a rather rigorous, rather severe life. And gradually their reputations spread far and wide. The heroism, the severity, the asceticism of their lives gradually influenced people. People thought, well, there must be something to this. And we had other young men, young women. Some of these establishments were for women. We're talking only about those for men. But young men gradually were attracted, and soon we had large monastic settlements. But interestingly, and it is interesting because it seems that there was something about the Irish character, the Irish love of individualism, whatever it is, but something about the Irish character that even when we had large monastic settlements, we still had these small groups. These men didn't get together in a big building, but still in the small beehives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 living together. However, we began to get our monastic settlement, which now, for instance, required 1 or more churches. Many of them, I suppose it's fair to use the word fetish, made a fetish of having 7 churches. There seemed to be something, after all, the 7 sacraments. You see, the figure 7 occurs in the Old Testament and the New Testament so much that perhaps out of some sort of piety, they use this number for their buildings even. More than the churches, however, they soon found that the labor in the fields wasn't a sufficient answer to their need for labor. They had a need for labor because they regarded labor as a form of prayer, and it was a form of discipline. Well, in their laboring, they discovered a need, for instance, for the production of church vessels, a need for the production of various kinds of artwork, artistry for church service, and we began to get magnificent examples of metal work and other sorts of work. This justly famous 12th century cross, for instance, was produced in one of the monastic workshops. Other church vessels, for instance, the Ardagh chalice, I think we may assume was produced in one such monastic workshop. The delicate filigree work and the Celtic tracery, the jewelling, the silver, the gold, the brass, the boss work in semi-precious stones, all of this is an example of the work done in these shops. And in their scriptoria, manuscripts were produced which still rank amongst the best to be found in the world anywhere. The detail, for instance, and this is only a slight example of the symbolism in connection with St. John, the detail rather impresses us today. Sometimes in as little a space as a square inch, we can find up to 150 different lines, separate lines, and not one of them crossing the other. Well, they acquired, you see, shops in which they produced their needs, that is, their church needs, their church religious need. They had, of course, the scriptoria. They had library, which was often their greatest treasure. The library, there's something interesting about the libraries, is the way in which they used to hang their books. I say hang. Books were so precious that they were put in leather satchels, and the leather satchels were decorated with this Celtic work and hung on a peg on the wall, so that if you were to enter a monastic library and look along the wall, you'd find anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 of these leather satchels. And we have the testimony of that Bede, for instance, the Venerable Bede, the famous Englishman. We have his testimony to the generosity of these Irish monastic establishments. Some of them drew as many as 3,000 students, and it's possible that one of them went up to about 3,500 students, some of these coming from as far away as Egypt. But Bede tells us that all who came from England for their education were received generously, open-heartedly, and never any remark about tuition. He indicates, indeed, that the number of Englishmen coming to some of these institutions was great enough so that some of them had a Saxon quarter, as we may have a Latin quarter today. Such then is the general background for the story of our hero. I think we might call him that, Kevin. This remarkable man, born in the 6th century and coming of a line of royal people. He is reputed to be one of the greatest of the Irish saints, and in many respects he reminds us of St. Francis of Assisi. That is, there are so many tales told about his gentleness with animals, and very often the symbols connected with him and the legends that grew up about him associate him with this gentleness and with animals. Now we're going then to investigate the story of Kevin and his founding of what was one of the greatest of the Irish monastic establishments, and that was the one at Glendalough. Some of you may have visited Glendalough. Others may yet have that opportunity awaiting them. But Glendalough is not far from Dublin. It's very easy to visit there by bus. But in the 6th century, there wasn't any Dublin metropolis nearby, and in any case, the distance would have seemed greater, so that he was retiring now to a rather remote place, to a place which is situated in a hollow in between or among 3 mountains where this dark water runs. This seemed quite remote at the time, and as the name might indicate to us, Glendalough, Glendalough we say, but Glendalough, the glen between 2 lakes. And the waters of this lake do seem dark enough as it's channeled in between its hills. And here it was that Kevin first made his establishment. This dark water, there's a legend that no skylark ever warbles over it. Whether that's fanciful or not, the story is that Kevin made the skylocks disappear because his working men in putting up the buildings here were working from the time of the lark's first song in the morning, and they simply became over-fatigued. Well, now, about 30 feet above that lake, you see it here as that dark spot almost in the center of the screen. 30 feet above that lake, St. Kevin made his first settlement, only himself. This represents a cave that is only about 3 feet high. Although it's about 30 feet above the water, the cave itself is about 3 feet high, about 7 feet long, and about 4 feet wide, and is hewn out of the solid rock. It was a natural cave. I don't mean that Kevin hewed it out. And here it was that he slept. And his fame spread out from this center and eventually attracted further disciples. This particular spot could not accommodate them all. I may divert for one moment to tell you that 600 years after his establishment, that same cave was used as the sleeping place of another abbot of this monastery. 600 years later, a man whose name you may or may not have heard, Lawrence O'Toole, Lorcan O'Toole. Well, back to our monastic establishment. Nearby, Kevin found another place, a place that offered more opportunities. And this is a modern view of what remains of this old establishment. And as we look upon this, we can distinguish several different types of buildings. Far in the distance, of course, you see that figure which dominates most Irish monastic sites, that is the round tower. And behind the wall of trees, you can see in closer view some of these ancient buildings, all of which we hope to, or at least many of which we hope to be able to describe for you today. These buildings survive, some of them from the 7th century, many of them from the 10th, and some of them from the 12th. This place has always been popular with visitors, even today. But I should like to read to you the words of Thackeray, a 19th century visitor, who said, "I think the Irish scene, just like the Irish melodies, sweet, wild, and sad, even in sunshine." Now, since he saw it in the 19th century, I think I'll point out to you what he saw. This is a 19th century artist's conception, and I'll go on with his description. "I do not know if there is any tune," says Thackeray, "about Glendalough, but if there be, it must be the most delicate, fantastic, fairy melody that ever was played. Only fancy can describe the charms of that delightful place." And here again we see what he saw in the 19th century. The 19th century gave us also a legend about this particular place, the legend of St. Kevin and the girl Kathleen who pursued him until he pushed her off the cliff into the lake. But this was the 19th century imagination. Let us instead move to that small building which you see on the extreme right and look at it in its modern appearance, given the romantic glow that the late afternoon can give it, and then a clearer view of it as it gradually shapes up to our view. This is called now St. Kevin's Kitchen, but it's a foolish name for it. It's actually a church which has been relatively unused since the 14th century, when it was severely, all of this area was, well, I suppose we can say just about destroyed by an invasion of the English from Dublin. However, after that, parts of it were rebuilt and reconditioned, so that this might have received a little use, but it's a very interesting building. Note that round tower built into the end of it. Again, it's a small building, only about 22.5 feet long and about 14 feet wide, with this very sharp, sloping roof, one stone laid upon another, and still watertight today. And this particular building dates really from about the 11th century. Now, we spoke of that little tower on the end of it, and previously we spoke of the domination of the monastic scene in Ireland by round towers. And this rather good example of one of those round towers might be interesting for us to look at. About 110 feet high, by the way, if you have your computer handy, and about 52 feet in circumference. These round towers are everywhere to be found where on old monastic sites. They are a peculiar feature of the Irish landscape. As we step back from this, we can understand why that is so. They stand out so above anything else. And whether they are to be seen close up or from afar. In this particular one, the comparison of the people and their height in relation to the height of the door is interesting. You see, among other things, the doors were quite a height above the ground because in times of danger, the monks of the community could retire to the round tower and pull their ladder up after them. So wherever we look, we see the round tower. But notice before it, in the right-hand part of your screen, we have the ruin of another building, which today is called the priest's house. It's not the name, of course, that was given to it in the 12th century. Its 12th century purposes may have been a mortuary, we're not certain, but at any rate, it is all that is left of the 12th century church, building. That round tower still plagues us, we notice, as we look out now through the window of what was called the cathedral, and what was a cathedral of which this arch is one of the few remaining relics. It possibly is not too easy for you to identify the pre-Romanesque carvings on here. Now, when we say a cathedral, we're not talking of one of the vast continental churches. This, after all, was only about 48 feet long. But we are talking about what was a cathedral nonetheless, a 10th century building. And nearby, we have this rather strange cross, a very peculiar example of the crucifixion carved into 12th century granite, something that I think when one sees, he immediately knows he's far in the past. And all of us have noticed the presence of graves here, rather free presence of them. And there goes a legend that since Kevin was buried here, others were anxious to be buried because they believed they might rise when he rose, that is, victoriously. And of course it was the favorite place for kings to be buried. And this particular church with its trabeate door, its door with the flat stone over it, although you can see an arch, do you see beyond it? But at any rate, this particular church, called Rhifort Church, was Rhi in Irish. Rhi means king. And this was the burial place of kings in this particular church. So we associate all of those graves with some of the antiquity and the holiness of this particular place, Glendalough. And as we leave, or indeed you might choose to enter by this way, since leaving or entering depends much upon where one started, we note this particular archway, a double arch. Our photograph can show us on the extreme left of your screen the beginning of another arch, and then this couple midway between both arches. And you might be able to take my word for it that beyond them is a flagstone road or way. And this is very interesting example. These two round-headed arches are the only examples that we have of an extant gateway to an old Irish monastic city. Well, we haven't had time indeed to explore the whole of this monastic city that was established by Kevin in the 6th century, but perhaps we have seen enough of it to make us realize that there were glorious days back in that period between the 6th and the 12th centuries, days that somehow or other do or did justify Dr. Johnson's famous remark about Ireland when he spoke of it really as the repository of human culture during dark and troubled times. These monastic cities existed in many different places in Ireland, but Glendalough is probably one of the most favored today by visitors simply because it's so conveniently reached from the metropolis. I should like to leave you with one or two of the legends that I indicated are associated with Kevin's name. In the first place, his name, Cuimhne, in Irish, means the of gentle birth. And since presumably he had the name before the stories arose, maybe we can't say that the name was given to him thereafter. All saints, of course, and all heroes, and even military men in our own time, have come to be surrounded by legend. And you know, it used to be the mark of the educated man, or perhaps I should say the supercilious man, to look down his nose upon these and to laugh at the legends and indicate, well, of course, in days gone by, people were a bit superstitious. But I think he overlooked something. All legends, even those in our own time, simply testify to the fact that the time thought a great deal of that man. And I think this particular one of many legends is interesting about Kevin. A friend of his was sick one day and yearning as only a sick person can for something completely unavailable. And he said, "Oh, if only I had an apple, I'd be so much better." And Kevin reached out his hand to a willow and plucked apples off it for his friend, so that down to the present time, Kevin's power and his gentleness, his thoughtfulness for others, is summed up in the phrase, Kevin's apples.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.